its goal. Regional authorities, organic identities, and natural hierarchies are all barriers to the centralization of power. In the 1940s, James Burnham introduced the idea of the managerial revolution that had radically altered the modern state. So this Soviet Russia, Nazi Germany, and liberal democracies like the United States may have significant differences, but ultimately each of these states was built on a managerial structure. After the Industrial Revolution, the paradigm of mass production and mass consumption required a shift in social organization. Large bureaucratic structures were required to meet the logistical, technical, and social challenges of mass society. And those organizations required a new class of experts to operate them. These mass bureaucratic structures promised a miraculous degree of material abundance by operating at scale. Logistical mastery would generate an enormous degree of wealth through efficiency. In order to reliably extract this degree of efficiency, the new class of experts would need to apply a standardized set of managerial techniques. Just as the uniformity of cogs in a machine are necessary for the operation of an assembly line, the mass managerial bureaucracy requires universalization to scale the massification of human organization. In his book Leviathan and Its Enemies, the paleoconservative theorist Samuel Francis continued James Burnham's critical work by outlining the process by which the managerial revolution dissolved the competing structures of bourgeois capitalism. While capital had already revolutionized many competing social spheres, managerialism required their complete abolition. Always and everywhere, power seeks to centralize, and managerialism draws its particular strength through centralization via mass bureaucratic social organization. The uniform application of managerial techniques is hindered by the cultural and moral particularity that competing spheres of social sovereignty generate. The individual worker who has a large family with many children may be unwilling to devote his entire life to the corporation. The devout Christian may oppose commerce on Sabbath or the practice of usury. The devout Muslim may require the observance of particular dietary restrictions. An individual whose family has lived in a region for generations may be unwilling to sacrifice the well-being of that particular community in the name of economic efficiency. Particular peoples with particular identities and ways of being are the enemies of universalized bureaucratic management. Francis also observed that the managerial elite attempt to break down these barriers to universal application by homogenizing culture. Hedonistic and cosmopolitan identities are highly malleable, so the managerial elite desire a deracinated population which can be more easily manipulated. By replacing dependency on morally and culturally particular structures like family and church with dependency on mass managerial structures like public education or the welfare state, the managerial class can gain power over the individual and separate them from other social spheres. This is why progressive secular humanism, or wokeness, if you prefer, is also an ally of the managerial revolution. Wokeness disincentivizes the creation of opposing social spheres of sovereignty by stigmatizing family formation and traditional religion while coding them as low status. Organic identities are replaced with more general and often commodifiable identities, which can be consumed and discarded. In the name of liberation, the individual is stripped of every duty and dependency, but is also made entirely dependent on the managerial regime. Without the natural protection of competing social spheres, the deracinated individual is left defenseless against the complex of state actors and corporations that now demand his total allegiance. In addition to outlining the cultural assimilation that managerialism would require, Sam Francis also predicted that the internal logic of managerialism would compel it to pursue globalization. Managerial structures produce their miracle of abundance through organization at scale, so the continuous expansion of their logistical network is always necessary. The boundaries of the nation are arbitrary barriers to the mass bureaucratic mindset, and once the managerial elite have completed their revolution inside the borders, they will naturally turn their gaze outward. New markets mean access to new consumers, new resources, and new laborers, but the revolution is never simply economic in nature. Managerial regimes find it easier to coordinate with other managerial regimes of the same order, which is why the United States and the wider West have been obsessed with the spread of liberal democracy. George W. Bush and other conservatives have often been mocked for the idea that at the heart of every nation lies a liberal democracy yearning to be free. Somewhere in Afghanistan, you just had George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Hamilton all just cowering in caves waiting for the United States to go ahead and unleash them on the rest of the world. But this is simply not an extension of the universalism, or rather, this is simply an extension of the universalism which the managerial revolution demands. Massified national organizations naturally seek to expand their power by becoming international organizations. The WHO, IMF, WEF, NATO, and several other international entities are all constantly seeking to add new nodes to the managerial network, creating a loose, globalized managerial order without any formal name. These organizations always emphasize problems on an international scale. Global warming, pandemic response, and world overpopulation are all issues that are too large for any one nation to address on its own. By focusing on large and abstract issues, the managerial elite can locate their decision-making centers well outside of the nation itself. This makes it almost impossible for the citizens of that nation to hold any real power accountable, even as they continue to participate in the democratic process at home. For the ever-expanding network of managerial bureaucracy to spread profitably to new regions, it must successfully homogenize culture. It's not enough for the culture to be uniform inside the nation, it must also become uniform across the entire international network. This conversion of nations into liberal democracies assists in the process. Democratic elites must introduce mass media, bureaucratic organization, and therapeutic amelioration for them to go ahead and achieve the kind of social engineering that's required to maintain power under a system of popular sovereignty. New democratic leaders in foreign countries thus benefit greatly from connecting their subjects to the global network of managers already established by the West. Mass media begins its work, and then McDonald's, Starbucks, and Apple stores inevitably follow. The particulars and history of the nation are slowly worn away as a tide of foreign culture flows in. International organizations become major employers as well as cultural staples and grow in importance until they are so integral to the operation of the country that no one can imagine a world without them. Managers and personnel flow over borders as naturally as the goods that those organizations produce. The very idea that people differ in any significant way from those of another country slowly disappears. No group has claim to any given nation because all nations are now part of the mass managerial network. The managerial elite develop international class interests because their independent networks make the nation itself interchangeable units. Managing a government is seen as no different from running an international corporation or a non-government organization. All of these entities feature similar bureaucratic structures, and the managers have an easy time moving between them. Just as it sought to homogenize culture inside its original borders, the global managerial order must break down the particularities of the nations to which they want to expand. This is why wokeness has gone international, with movements like Black Lives Matter gaining traction in countries like England or Ireland, where no history of racialized conflict really exists. Starbucks is running ads about transgenderism in India right now for a reason. And it has everything to do with coffee consumption if you understand it correctly. Countries like the United States are using gay rights as the justification to go ahead and send tens or hundreds of billions of dollars to Ukraine or Israel. Progressive secular humanism is the universal acid meant to dissolve all cultural particularities and turn the people of each nation into blank slates onto which managerial techniques can be freely pressed. The good news for those of us that acknowledge the nation as the form of social organization most conducive to human flourishing is that the current managerial order cannot stand. Humans are simply not fungible widgets who can be easily exchanged or replaced. We are not meant to be stripped of our heritage, traditions, religion, language, in a quest to simply dissemble the bureaucratic Tower of Babel. Like the Soviet Union, or like Soviet communism, managerial liberalism has made faulty assumptions about human nature which will doom its project. Like the late Soviet Union, late-stage liberal managerialism will eventually come apart. The only question will be, do the nations of the West have leaders ready to shepherd their people to a brighter future?
Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Presumably you can. Let me begin my remarks by stating that I do not believe in the concept or reality of late liberalism. And I don't think anybody's surprised to learn that if you've read my book, After Liberalism, in which I make the argument that most of what we describe as late liberalism, whatever comes before late liberalism, is actually post-liberal. And that John Dewey is not a liberal thinker, but a post-liberal thinker. And that liberalism is the major intellectual, cultural, social force of 19th century Western Europe and the United States. But at a certain point it ends and is replaced by other forces and other dominant movements. First of all, I do have a methodological problem with the term late. As an historian, I think it is overused. It is an attempt to see as a unitary development, or as part of a unitary development, what may be a transitional period to something else, or which may be the beginning of something new that is happening, the newness of which we do not yet recognize entirely. But beyond that, I might say bookish argument or cavil against the word late, I would say that I'm particularly annoyed by the use of the term late liberal, something which my book After Liberalism goes into at some length. Through much of the 20th century, Anglo-American societies have applied liberal to describe distinctly unliberal activities, like building vast administrative states, which Auron just described, that aim at reconstructing the family, or allowing government bureaucrats to redistribute our earnings as a form of social engineering. This increasingly elastic use of liberals started primarily among social and welfare state Democrats more than a century ago, and this practice shows no signs of going away. The same label has been stretched to cover a wide variety of projects, like destroying gender identity, degrading white people, and mutilating the bodies of minors through gender-affirming surgery. All such perverse initiatives are now described as liberal, because this operative term, so argues my work After Liberalism, has become unbounded as to meaning. Liberal is something we're supposed to applaud. Therefore, since at least the progressive era in the U.S., anything social reformers have tried to implement or inflict on us is called liberal and traced back to Thomas Jefferson or perhaps now Barack Obama. The prominent early 20th century educator John Dewey managed to give socialist experiments a catchy label by calling them liberal. Dewey distinguished between his liberalism and the older, supposedly outmoded form of his body of ideas. Apparently his transmogrified liberalism was truly liberal because it was more about equality than the liberalism it replaced. More recently, we've had other enthusiastic claimants to the liberal title. There are classical liberals, aka libertarians, and those who view themselves as liberals because they are demanding more open academic discussion. We also have progressive zealots who insist, as did John Stuart Mill and John Dewey in earlier times, that they are perfecting liberal thought. They are carrying this heirloom to enlightened conclusions that less tolerant and less perfect liberals in the past hesitated to embrace. Our self-proclaimed liberals who have colonized our media and universities are now seeking in the name of liberalism to punish white male Christians. What is sometimes called reverse discrimination is supposed to bring forth a society of equals in which liberal ideas can finally be practiced on a supposedly level playing field. Liberalism has an historic context, and it was shaped by social, moral, and material circumstances. It was first of all the idea of the bourgeoisie, which became embodied in concrete institutions and relationships. It was not the imperfect beginning of later leftist experiments, or the preferred values of intellectuals who are hoping to fine-tune earlier leftist advances. Liberalism once had a cohesive identity. Liberals, for example, generally favored limited suffrage that excluded women and non-property holders. they didn't take that position because they weren't fully liberal. They did so because they were seeking what was then a recognized liberal good, accountable government, while trying not to produce an excessively large franchise, which might result in property confiscation and political tyranny. In any case, these liberals believed that only the educated and property could muster the necessary discipline to allow constitutional government to function. Although liberals viewed women as having human dignity and certainly not as chattel, they continued to believe in the value of traditional gender distinctions, a view that led them to hold fast to the idea that women should, save for some exceptions, be homemakers, not politically engaged. Presumably, one might even favor extending the franchise to women without being removed to liberal fellowship. But the point that I emphasize is there was nothing illiberal in terms of how liberal was understood for at least a century or more, in not counting women among the franchise. Liberals also favored academic freedom and debating political differences, but drew critical lines as to how far they would carry their freedom principle. For example, they had a strong sense of social decency and didn't believe that political discussion should lead to violence or insulting conduct. Liberals, properly understood, as I tried to do in my work after liberalism, carried with them a heritage rooted in the Bible, classical sources, and an ingrained code of social behavior. Mind you, I'm certainly not saying that nothing in the liberal heritage can be meaningfully defended in a post-liberal age. What I am suggesting is that this excavation work becomes increasingly difficult as one moves beyond the institutions and world of thought that gave birth to a liberal order. And we should be on guard against exaggerating the extent of the victories we've achieved in trying to uphold liberal ideals in a post-liberal society. They've been extremely meager. A more relevant issue than who can appropriate the liberal label at this time is what can be done to protect us against woke totalitarians. This is an urgent question of survival for all decent people in Western societies, as we are dealing with a left that is drunk with power and eager to reconstruct our consciousness. Edmund Burke's letter on the regicide peace provides a sober warning about the direction in which we may be going. In their culture, meaning that of the Jacobin, it is a rule always to graft virtue onto vices. They think everything unworthy of the name of virtue unless it indicates violence on the private. All their new institutions, and with them everything is new, strike at the root of our social nature. Precisely because the contemporary left, even more than the Jacobins whom Burke excoriated, strike at the roots of our social nature, it may be necessary to organize effectively against them. But we are not advancing that effort by imagining that we're still living in a liberal society and can successfully rebuild its institutions. We no longer inhabit that world or enjoy that option. Counting on civility and fair play from our opposition is an utterly naive assumption. LGBT enthusiasts who have both state and media winds at their back are delighted to violate the one-time guaranteed rights of those who resist them. And this culturally radical left couldn't care less about what a white heterosexual once said and what they regard as the Stone Age about tolerance and reason. Leftist organizers in Western countries now call on mercenary mobs to do their bidding, while state administrators turn their backs on the ensuing violence, and the MSM blames such incidents on religious fanatics and white nationalists. In any case, I see less and less of a liberal aspect, even a vestigial one, and what some might still choose to call late liberalism. Thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks for organizing this interesting panel. Sometimes when you're asked to give a talk, you find that it's already been titled for you. And on this case, I was informed when I got the program that the title of my talk was on the persecution of whites in America. And I thought, wow, persecution. I mean, it's not really accurate. I've said a lot of edgy things. I say a lot of edgy things in my book. Persecution is a very strong word. So of course, like any good scholar, I went to the dictionary, and I found persecution to be defined as hostility and ill treatment, especially on the basis of ethnicity, religion, or political beliefs. Okay, maybe persecution is a fair description of what's going on out here. And in my new book, The Unprotected Class, How Anti-White Racism is Tearing America Apart, I've talked a lot, and particularly when I've given interviews about the book, of not wanting to create a new victim class. And I actually believe that. I'm not here to encourage white people to whine to the refs, because the refs don't like you anyway, by the way. But I am encouraging us to work in concert with non-white allies who are interested in principles of equal justice under the law, and that take our fate into our own hands and to stand up for our unalienable rights that are guaranteed, supposedly at least, to all Americans in the Declaration. In my book, I discuss how our anti-white regime manifests in dozens of areas, and I have chapters on education, crime, real estate, immigration, healthcare, military, the church, etc. We have short time, so I'm not going to get into any detail here. You're welcome to read the book. But it's been very well received, which has been gratifying both by reviewers and actual readers. I think more importantly, and I say this not to toot my own horn, but because I think it indicates a shifting of the zeitgeist, which we should all welcome, it's received a lot of interest on the Hill. Yesterday I was asked by a number of senior Hill staffers to come give a presentation on the book, and then afterwards a staffer of a very, very mainstream member, senior, kind of pretty well-known member, took me aside and said, my boss would like to talk to you. And I spent an hour talking to him about my book. And I think that that's an indication that the Overton window on this issue is shifting in some very interesting ways. And so I guess, ultimately you kind of ask, especially I asked myself when I decided to write this book, why write on such an unpleasant subject? And ultimately I think it's because we can't really, to be a little bit trite, we can't save the country without kind of addressing this. In my view, it's certainly not a sufficient condition, but it is, I would argue, a necessary condition. But what I found, encouragingly, in talking to just about everyone on the genuine right in this conversation, and not just people who were kind enough to endorse the book, like Tucker Carlson or Charlie Kirk or Victor Davis Hanson, or Peter Kirsanow, who's about to become the longest serving member of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. But people who just had me on their shows, and that ranged in the conservative world from Trump Jr. to Andrew Clavin. So there's like a pretty big, line of different folks. And people wanted to have that conversation. And I didn't, encounter a lot of resistance. And so I think the left is not ready to have that conversation. But if we're only going to have the conversations the left decides that we're going to have, we might as well just pack up and go home. So I think that, again, this is very encouraging and doesn't have, again, anything to do per se with me or the book, but just because the time has really shifted, and there's some good things about that and bad things about that. So, one question I get a lot from skeptics is, well, what evidence do you have that white people are being treated badly by our current system? Whites seem to be doing pretty well. Well, first of all, that's just wrong empirically, right? For those of you familiar with the work of Angus Deaton, the Nobel Prize-winning economist at Princeton, and his wife Ann Case, also a distinguished economist, we find white people in record numbers, particularly the white middle and working class, dying so-called deaths of despair. So these are alcohol and drug overdoses and suicide. And you're seeing a lot of that. Secondly, it kind of depends on what you're using as comparatives. Whites are obviously doing better in certain kind of circles than some other groups, but if you compare whites to Asian Americans, which is a group that often the left loves to erase, we're worse off in every single category, whether it be health, wealth, education, you kind of name it, all down the line. And one of the things I talk about in my book is I'll also look at kind of average white incomes and social outcomes as compared to even immigrants from some parts of Africa, from some parts of South America, from most parts of Asia. And again, whites actually trail pretty significantly. So, that's kind of one indication that whites are not doing well. So like the whites who are left in Silicon Valley, yeah, they're doing pretty well. Appalachian whites, the people who are literally the single most likely group to check off American on their census form when they're asked about their origin, there's almost nobody in America who's doing worse on any social indicators than that group. Other evidence. You can look at what Steve Saylor has called a flight from white. And this is an explosion of non-white identification that we've had, and we see this on a variety of different spheres. I'll just give you one example. In 1960, Native Americans, there were about 550,000 self-identified in the census. it was 0.3% of the population. In 2020, we have 9.6 million, and it's over 3. Now, this is not due to a Native American fertility explosion. Again, I document this. It's a bunch of white people with, hopefully, in some cases, at least some traceable Native American ancestry, who decided that's a much better horse to ride in 2024. And by the way, they're not wrong, okay, to think that. So, there's another evidence. And then, ask any job applicant or college applicant. Do you check the white box? Not if you can avoid it. And then I'll have the sort of, this is often euphemized as diversity. But as I show in my book, diverse is almost inevitably simply a synonym for less white. And in fact, I point out a number of places where adding whites to a particular system would actually improve diversity, but nobody's interested in doing that because really all they're interested in is having less white people involved. A trivial but sort of fun, I think, illustrative example again of kind of how it's not so great to be white these days is the original title that I had for my book was somewhat impish. It was going to be called "It's Okay to Be White," and I actually got that by my editors, to my slight surprise. I have one of them actually sitting here in the front row. But then eventually, like a couple months later, they came back to me and said, sorry, the sales staff says that we're not going to be able to sell that into Costco and Barnes & Noble with that title. And the trivial thing is it sounds trivial, and it was, but if I had a book that was entitled "It's Okay to Be Hispanic," or "It's Okay to Be Black," or "It's Okay to Be Asian American," nobody would think twice. But if I say "It's okay to be white," I might as well just put on my KKK hood right now, right? And so I think that's just indicative of where we are in terms of how whiteness is viewed by society. So there's some more serious questions. That's obviously a little bit in fun that I think are kind of raised by all this. And the first is, what happens when an ethnic community that is largely and historically responsible, just as a matter of pure numbers, if nothing else, for building American society and its institutions, goes from a dominant position to just being one group among many, and legally, culturally, a disfavored group at that? What does a post-white America look like? Especially when a post-white America actively denigrates much of the cultural, political, and social legacy that built the country. Can America and its institutions survive that kind of a transformation? And how do we avoid the sort of civil strife and ethnic violence that has characterized so many other, not every, don't be too black-pilled, not every multi-ethnic society, but huge percentage of multi-ethnic societies in the past. So we're in the midst of a vast demographic transformation, a kind of uncontrolled social experiment. And just to give you a sense, if you were to look at the 1960 census, which was right before the Hart-Celler Immigration Act of 1965, which radically transformed America's demographics, we were about 86, 87% white non-Hispanic, 10 or 11% African American, 3% everything else, which mostly was Hispanics, 80% of whom were native-born Americans at that point, as opposed to about 60% now, and some of whom, the Californios, the Tejanos, et cetera, actually had roots going back in the territory of the United States for hundreds of years, even before they were part of the United States. So much more tightly integrated group overall. You compare that to where we are today, 60 years after Hart-Celler. We're now a 57% white non-Hispanic country. Among under 18s, we are now a white non-Hispanic minority. And this has just been a huge demographic transformation. Dare I even say it, a great replacement of whites. And speaking of great replacement, by the way, what we saw, because this is not just a US phenomenon, what we saw in France with this recent election of national rally is the same sort of phenomenon, just on a different substrate. So, it was really fascinating to me intellectually, because other parties in France, they claim to be about a lot of other things. But whether they're literal communists or alleged free marketeers, ultimately, when the chips were down, when a gun was put to their head and they had to make a choice, their choice was to be the party of replacement, to be the party that was going to replace the French people with foreigners. And that was the underlying thing that they would not compromise on. And the communists were willing to get in bed with the capitalists. It didn't matter, right? I'm not saying these are not real distinctions. I'm not going to be that conspiratorial about it. But at the end, they were secondary distinctions to their belief in globalism, to their belief in rule by Brussels, and to their belief in the replacement of the French population. So I think that's what's going on. Every single French party, besides National Rally, revealed itself to be the party of the Great Replacement. that's the reality of what was going on in France. So, I thought this put it really well. Michel Houellebecq, the famous French author, kind of comments, because the left always screams when you say great replacement, which is why I'm saying I hope there's some leftist journalists in the room. I was shocked that they said it was called a theory. It's not a theory, it's a fact. I thought Vivek Ramaswamy put it actually really great in the US presidential debates. He said, this isn't some grand right-wing conspiracy theory, it's a basic statement of the Democratic Party's platform. And I think that's exactly right. So I spent several years of my life personally living and traveling in the developing world. I was talking to an Indian gentleman here a little bit earlier in the conference, and he was telling me a little bit about what he was doing in Indian politics, and I sort of cut him short. I said, actually, I used to live in India, so I'm kind of very familiar. I wrote for the Indian Express, and I think it's sort of indicative that a lot of the so-called far-right people I know are actually some of the best traveled and culturally knowledgeable people, most culturally knowledgeable people I know. And it's because we understand and respect other cultures that we guard the integrity of our own. And I can understand why Modi wants India to be a Hindu nation, because I want America to be a Christian nation, defined not in total, but in part by its European historic identity. I get where they're coming from. This is a little bit like our conference organizer kind of calling for this transnational alliance of nationalists earlier. So I get that vibe. I don't think it's possible to talk about any of this without talking about civil rights. And there's some questions onto our side of the aisle as to whether we should need to use civil rights law or fundamentally reform it, and I think the answer is both. We both need to use it right now for really aggressive lawfare. My friends at America First Legal, Stephen Miller, are doing a really outstanding job right now at doing this, but I also think we need to fundamentally transform a set of laws that were really designed for a world 60 years ago that no longer really exists, and we have a very different set of problems today, and so I think we need to fundamentally relook at them, and that's obviously going to be a big political lift, but I think it's a necessary political lift. And then finally, I want to conclude by talking a little bit about our original title, Persecution. And in fact, I realized as I was saying, wow, persecution, that's kind of edgy, that in my book, I actually talk about something even perhaps more extreme, American whites as being victims of a cultural genocide. And I'm suggesting this partially, again, to troll any leftist media who might be in the room. They'd be furiously scribbling my unforgivable hate speech in their notebooks. But I'm not saying it entirely for that purpose. And what's the historical justification for saying kind of such an outrageous thing? Well, Raphael Lemkin, who's the Polish-Jewish lawyer who invented the term genocide, in 1948, he was working with the United Nations and formulated the Genocide Convention. He had a broader definition of genocide than actually ultimately went into the thing, because some countries vetoed it because they were worried politically. But he had this concept of cultural genocide, which has actually been picked up by a number of leftist scholars subsequently to kind of describe various situations. So for Lemkin, a cultural genocide consisted of, among other things, the mass distribution of intoxicants, the re-education of children, forced relocation, and the destruction of important cultural symbols. I discuss in my book how each one of these things could be accurately described as what's going on with whites in America right now. And so even though white genocide has been, the favorite term of perhaps the farthest reaches of the right, I don't know that it's an inaccurate description of, look through a certain lens, the situation we're in today. So, why is this all going on? Because I think it doesn't just spring fully armored like Athena from Zeus's head for no reason, right? Like that's just not how social phenomena work. I think that ultimately this is a justification for resource distribution. The late sociologist C. Wright Mills talks a lot about the concept of an illegitimating ideology. In 2024, you don't just go up to a group and say, hey, I'm taking your stuff. Right? So what you do is you say white supremacy, white privilege, white fragility, and by the way, you're so awful, that's why I'm getting your stuff. And I think you can understand, and again I spell this out in quite some detail in my book, affirmative action, racially punitive taxation, reparations, the land back movement, all sorts of re-education can be understood as ultimately being viewed through that lens. So where does this need to go? Persecution. It's not a word I've used in the past. We do have anti-white persecution in America. Perhaps it's not strong enough, even as I suggest. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that somehow every white American's life has become a dystopian hellscape out of 1984. Clearly, that's not the case. However, in particular, I've done a lot of talks to young people. One interesting, the first media interview I did, big media interview I did on the book was with Charlie Kirk. And Charlie said, Jerry, whenever I talk to my older donors, they get a little freaked out about this. They're like, can you say that? Is that allowed? Every time I go on a college campus, every white student comes up to me and says, thank you. This is like the #1 issue, right, for me right now as a young white American. So I think there's a generational divide that is happening. Now, by the way, there are some older people who totally get this, but I think that's also been my experience in talking about the book. I gave an enthusiastic talk to the DC Young Republicans last night, and they kind of all just get it. But the good news is that we have tools to stop this persecution. We are thankfully not a 1 or 2% minority in this country. We're still the majority. We still have huge numbers of Americans of every ethnic background who are interested in America's founding ideals, principles, the idea of equal justice under the law. I have a number of folks who endorse my book, who are very obviously and visibly, if you know them, not white. So I think that we have potential allies in the country, in the room, and all we need to be willing to do is to be willing to be brave enough and have enough integrity to take our own side in this fight. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Clifford, and all of you for being here. I have prepared remarks like everybody else, but going last and then also following the plenary session with Dr. Moeller and Doug Wilson, I'm going to depart from my comments a little bit and respond to some things. First of all, I respond to the Alaska comment. I'm from Alaska, so I moved back last summer, which is actually related to some of what I talk about in my book and what we're talking about here today. I lived for many years in Austin, Texas, which is a fine place to live for quality of life, I suppose, but it's not the kind of place you want to raise a family. So I moved home and building a log cabin in the woods, which I encourage you all to go do. But I want to talk about the subject at hand here and not about Alaska. And I was originally going to title this talk "How to Fight a Religious War," but it occurs to me that you have to sort of accept that you're in a religious war before you talk about how to fight one. And I would suggest to you today that we are in the middle of a religious war. And if that sounds, as shocking as Jeremy saying that maybe persecution of whites sounds shocking, I would suggest to you that it's not. For as great as the talk was with Doug Wilson and Dr. Moeller, and I do think that they get it, but part of this is a category problem. They kept talking about secular liberalism and woke leftists and sort of like or even the illiberal left, right? We have to understand that it's not quite right to call them the secular leftists, like they just don't believe in anything. They have their own religion, and they're waging a religious war against us, against the Christian side. You don't even have to be Christian to be on the Christian side. You just have to be an American who believes in the founding principles of this country. And that might strike some people as odd to say we're in a religious war and there's two warring religions here, because we're supposed to be this, America's supposed to be a country that has separation of church and state. We're not supposed to be a theocracy. We respect individual rights and free exercise of religion. And how could we be in the middle of a religious war? And this has been touched on in this panel and on the last session as well. The reason is because our country, like all countries, are based on theological and religious claims. We're used to talking about America as a propositional nation, right? And the phrase comes from Abraham Lincoln's famous line in the Gettysburg Address that America was dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. The idea, or that proposition, that's different than the nation states, the ethnic nation states of Europe that were based on blood and soil and religion. We supposedly transcended all that and instead founded a country on an idea, a proposition, and anyone can become an American if they accept the proposition. And that's all true. But nearly everybody who says that America is a propositional nation is wrong about what the proposition is, right? We're not a collection of Enlightenment tropes. We're not a grab bag of ideas at the intersection of Locke and Rousseau. We're the creation of Christian civilization, which is to say that the proposition at the heart of our country that undergirds our existence is Christianity and all that comes with it. That's the proposition. So without Christianity, you don't get free speech, you don't get liberty, you don't get equality, you don't get freedom of conscience, and you certainly don't get consent of the governed. So we need to be clear about that, like as our starting place, right? And some people will acknowledge that and will agree with that, and they'll say yes, our inheritance as Americans is Christianity, but they'll insist that that's a point of departure. That once the American experiment was launched, we could safely separate the religion that launched it from the nation that now existed. And we could take the best parts of Christianity and kind of discard the actual religion. No need to continually affirm Christ. We've got Christless Christianity, and we're off to the races now. And you actually hear these arguments today, amazingly. It doesn't work like that. And I remember somebody mentioned Richard Dawkins earlier. I'm glad they did. A few months ago, he gave this interview. He's the famous atheist, Richard Dawkins. He gave an interview to some media outlet, BBC or something, and he was lamenting how cultural Christianity seemed to be going away in England. And he sort of was flummoxed as to why we couldn't have cultural Christianity and discard sort of believing Christians. He wanted Christless Christianity. He wanted the culture without the cult. And he said, he loves these cathedrals and he loves Christmas carols and he wants to have more cultural Christians like him. And actually said in this interview that we need fewer believing Christians. And it didn't seem to occur to him that if there's nobody to pray in the cathedrals, if there's nobody to worship in these places of worship, they're going to turn into apartment complexes, or in England's case, they're going to turn into mosques. If there's nobody who believes what is proclaimed in the Christmas carols, nobody's going to sing them. So again, you don't get the culture without the cult. And the spectacle of his own country should have been enough to convince him of that. But apparently it's not. So committed was he to this idea that I just mentioned earlier, that you could have kind of separate the religion, from the nation that it founds, and then just continue subsisting off the capital of this religion without ever replenishing it, without ever dipping into that well continually. It doesn't work. You can't do that. So that's the situation that we're in. We are living off of an inheritance that we've used up. And if we're not going to be a Christian country, we're not going to have a republic. The same that goes for England goes for America. Our proposition, right, that all men are created equal, it's a religious claim. It's specifically a Christian claim. And I don't want to belabor the point, but the reason we say all men are created equal is because we believe we're children of God. And we stand equal before the law because we stand equally before God. And if you get rid of that idea, if you say we don't need that theological underpinning, Dr. Muller talked about this, he used the word ontological a whole bunch of times, but this is what he's getting at. If you get rid of that, the whole system collapses because there's no justification for it. There's no justification for freedom of speech or free exercise of religion or consent of the governed or limited government. They don't cohere. They make no sense at all. So what happens when you discard those ideas? I think what happens is what we're seeing happen right now. Something else comes in. Some other political order asserts itself. This idea that the individual person is somehow sacred and created in the image of God, that is only self-evident to a moral conscience that is formed and awakened by the teachings of Christianity. And I would say, as a Christian and a Catholic myself, teachings that come from Christ himself, right? So the American founding, that is to say, is not comprehensible in strictly secular or liberal or atheistic terms, right? Our nation begins with a proposition about the nature of God and man, and everything else flows from that. If that proposition is discarded or denied, then whatever comes after that isn't America. It might call itself America, it might even invoke a familiar vocabulary of rights and liberties, but it's not America. Thank you. So to bring this back to, so when I say we're engaged in a religious war, this is what I mean. And so who's on the other side of it? My book that came out a couple months ago argues that there's really only one alternative to Christianity, and and in the American context to a Christian nation, and that is a pagan society and a pagan America. If that strikes you as like a bit, what do you mean pagan? It kind of sounds crazy or maybe extreme. What I mean is simply the rejection of the proposition that all men are created equal. The inversion of the Christian claims that are at the heart of our country. That is to say, all men are not created equal, some are slaves and some are masters, and society should be organized on that basis. That is the other side in this religious war. And part of our task right now, and part of the reason I wrote a whole book about it, is that I think people are having a hard time wrapping their minds around that. It's hard to accept that that's what we're up against. It's hard to accept that we are moving into and really are in and have been for some time in a post-Christian era in the West. And what's rising up in the midst of this post-Christian era comes out of the past. It comes out of the pre-Christian era. And it posits a total inversion of the Christian worldview, a rejection of transcendent truth, a rejection of moral absolutes, a rejection of reality itself, which are all in turn a rejection of the Christian God. And the claims that Christendom has made down the ages. The post-Christian paganism I'm describing, it's not going to outwardly look like the paganism of the past. Not always. I mean, in some cases it'll ape it, right? If you've seen the explosion of interest in witchcraft, among young people, for example, or the way we talk about abortion now, quite pagan indeed. But even in cases where it doesn't look like, explicitly look like paganism as we popularly understand it, it'll be no less hostile to and incompatible with Christianity and with a nation organized around the claims of the Christian religion. It rejects those claims and posits, as I said, this inversion of them. And the political order that comes out of that is one that's not based on human liberty and rights. It's based on power and force and coercion. That's the political order that we're up against. In the religious war that we're fighting, that's the side that we're fighting. The side of coercion and force. The side that says, the mass of people are slaves, and they're to be ruled by an elect class of people who are naturally masters. And I don't have to spell out the ways to you all that we see this emerging in our time, and with our political class now. That's exactly what they believe. And part of, again, wrapping your heads around this is to accept the fact that if we reject the Christian foundation of America, then the people who run this country, the neo-pagan elite, how much do you think they care about your freedom of speech? or your ability to worship and have free exercise of your religion, or your freedom to associate involuntary associations. They don't care about that at all. They have no reason to. The basis on which they would care about that has been totally rejected. It has no coherence. And in place of that, they're going to put in a system that's based on power. And they're the ones who have it. So, I don't mean to blackpill everybody, but like, you just, in order to have any hope at all, you have to kind of accept the reality. You have to kind of I find that there's a relief in just accepting what is happening and being honest about it, right? We don't have to kid ourselves anymore. Late liberalism, this panel is called Surviving Late Liberalism. You can't survive late liberalism, you have to completely destroy it. So, which gets maybe to the last part, and then I'll stop talking, you guys can ask questions. The first place that we have to start to fight this is to shed this false notion that religion is this private matter and that there's this wall of separation between our politics and our religion. And we have to agree and argue and proclaim without apology that public life in this country should be shaped by Christian morality and ordered by an adherence to its dictates, as it was for most of our civilization's history and as it was in the founding of this country as well. And most of all, we have to accept that our culture of self-government and liberty under law can't survive cut off from its source, which was and always will be the Christian faith. And without that faith, active and alive among the people, not just in theory, but in practice, there is no American Republic. There won't be. And so if we want to save it, if we want to save the Republic, we have to become a Christian nation once again. We have to convert our countrymen back to their native religion, if you will. And we have to win this religious war, because we're finding out now the stakes are as high as they can possibly be, and we know that there's more than one way for a nation to fall, right? There's the Roman way, which is a centuries-long decline of succumbing to wave upon wave of invaders. There's the British way, which we touched on earlier, which is a dwindling irrelevance and impotence in the face of, in England's case, an assertive Muslim immigrant population. And then there's the American way, which is not to decline and fall. It's not to succumb to dwindle into irrelevance, but it's simply to become evil. So that's what we had to fight.
And I invite people to come to the microphone, ask questions. You can direct them at one or more panelists. I will be timing you, so if you get too long, I'm going to cut you off. So please try and be precise. I would like to start us off, though, with just a brief reflection on the question of, coming from each of your different perspectives and the talks that you gave, how, in your perspective, can we restore on a civilization level, in the popular mind, the distinction between liberty and license? How do we recover the moral framework that civilization requires in the different spheres that you guys talked about? Maybe Auron, if you want to talk, and then
yeah, I guess the biggest thing is that almost no one exists in a true community anymore. And if you don't exist in a true community, you can't practice virtue, and if you can't practice virtue, then you can't establish order and liberty. And so I don't see any way forward for us to go ahead and do this on a global scale, or even in many cases on a national scale, until we figure out, in a very modern sense, how to still organize ourselves into communities where we can practice virtue. I don't think we're going to be able to escape the problem we're currently facing.
I suppose I'm next. I'm perhaps, owing to my age and how much I've seen in life, very pessimistic. I think there are two ways by which the good guys can take back some power or some control of their lives. One is being able somehow to defeat the forces of evil. And I think the left is really evil. I would have to agree with most of the speakers answer. I don't think it's simply a matter of political difference or and economic issues. They are trying to destroy, they don't want power. They want to pervert beyond. There's all kinds of things that they're doing that is absolutely terrible. But unless we can acquire some kind of power, some kind of counterforce, they're going to go on doing this. And we need something a lot better than what I call Conservatism Incorporated, to carry out this task. The other way, to which I think Auron is sort of alluding, is if we can find some way to wall off communities so that it is possible for people to separate themselves successfully from the central government, from the MSM, from the dominant culture, all of which I think are toxic at this point. I don't know exactly how we achieve those ends, but that unless we can do something to effectively fight back against the left, and it's not just a matter of running seminars or discussing, as I say, value discussions, but being able to create an effective counterforce at every level, it is going to be very, very hard to win this struggle.
Yeah, I'd actually agree with both of your comments. Both community and counterforce are necessary. And honestly, done right, the community, in particular religious communities, I think have a significant role to play there, but not exclusively, is the most natural form that a counterforce might take. And so I think that that's great. And I'd say the other thing, which I referenced in my talk, is just the courage to speak up. I think there is an element I talk in my book about, there's a very well-known political scientist at Duke named Timur Kuran, who's actually moved considerably to the right, it seems like, in the last few years, but he has a concept of preference cascades and preference falsification, the idea that people don't really reveal their own views about things in an accurate way, and then suddenly when a few people speak up, you can get sometimes these cascades where people reveal their true views. And obviously that can work positively or negatively depending on what those views are. But I think that there's a lot of people out there who are looking at a variety of social forces, and they're really discomfited, if not horrified, by what they see, but they don't have people advocating for them. And I tried to do that in a small way in my small area in the book, but I think we could just do that, multiply that times 100 different areas where leftism is corrupting America, and we could really make some progress.
Yeah, I agree with all these comments on liberty and how to inculcate it and how to wall it off or distinguish it from license. The other thing I would add is to Auron's comment about being in community, and it gives you the opportunity to practice virtue. It also gives you a sort of a beachhead from which to bring virtue from the private sphere into the public sphere. And one of the things I talk about at the end of my book is to find and fight on ground you can win, right? You may not be able to change things in Washington, D.C., but you can change things in maybe your hometown or a smaller community. You build and invest in your religious community, in your family, in your neighborhood, and then from there, you don't just keep those things walled off into a private sphere. You go out into the town square. You help get good people elected to the local city council to take over the library and the school board, to get the pornography out of the libraries and schools, to have Christmas parades and have Saints' Day processions, in public, and proclaim those things that we've been told belong to the private sphere, to bring them out into the public square again.
Thank you. All right, we have until 1:10, so if you're counting, we've got plenty of time right now. So we'll try and keep our questions brief so we can get to all of them. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Hello, testing. Okay, great. My name is Andrew Beck. John, it's great to meet you. We've followed each other on Twitter, I think, for a little while. The concept of Christian civilization, needing to re-Christianize America, realizing that there has been this de-Christianization that has happened, and that what the responsibility of the Christian is, right, to kind of focus locally and engage in the public square. I firmly believe in this. what do you think of this concept of, rather than like kind of going for people on the individual level, as in the masses, to really go, since we are in a religious war, looking at how Europe was Christianized initially, right? Going from being very pagan to becoming Christian over time, they go for the elites. They go for the tribal leaders. They go for the kings and the chieftains. They go for the kind of, lords and ladies. We even had the example in the New Testament of Cornelius being the one, and then his entire house also. What do you think of that strategy for re-Christianization of America, going for the elites?
I think it's great. I'm all for it. I think there's a reason that it was so successful in Europe. Going for and not just in Europe too, like in the Near East, in the first decades, the first generations of Christianity, it was often the Roman elites and the aristocratic families in the cities where Christianity first spread, and it wasn't until centuries later that it started to spread into areas that were sort of outside the Roman centers of administration and power, as it got into areas of Northern Europe. I think it's we need to think about that, and we need to invest time strategizing about how to leverage that. Just this past year, there's been a couple of high-profile conversions to Catholicism among people on the right. Thinking of Tammy Peterson and Candace Owens, whatever one thinks of her. But I think those things in a media environment like ours, they are important and they are effective, and I think they also kind of can be a, to what Jeremy was just talking about, like provide like almost like a permission structure for other people to be like, okay, well, maybe it's not crazy for me to think about this for myself and my family, and maybe there's something here that I need to look into. I think if Jordan Peterson followed his wife into the church, I think that would cause a lot of people, especially young men who have listened to him for years, to ask themselves some serious questions about their own path.
The question for Jeremy, obviously the anti-whiteism of the regime is obvious. 100 years ago people passed for white, now we're trying to pass for white. But my point is that I think there's more to it than just white man bad, and I want your reaction to that. And the point is to prevent the development of a majority population. Because the professional managerial elite can be opposed if there is a majority population to represent the nation, and the majority is expanded. Quakers weren't even part of the majority in colonial Massachusetts, and Hispanics and Asians and their children and grandchildren, if there were less immigration and no race laws, would stop being minorities. They would do whatever they're going to do. You have a quinceanera, who cares? It would become a kind of ethnic and genealogical thing rather than a political minority identity. And the whole point, I think, of what you're talking about, as far as the leadership class is concerned, is to make sure we have a nation of all minorities without a majority population.
No, I think that's absolutely right. And actually, one of the main things that I discuss in my book is my sharp point of departure from white nationalists, in case it wasn't clear from my talk, is that I believe in ethnogenesis, which is to say that there is no kind of like, there's not some magic pagan Norse god that we all need to be descended from to like make this like a valid. That's not like, I'm not reifying whiteness in that way. I think these can be very flexible categories over time, especially as you get control of the border. That's why it's one of the kind of core recommendations that I have. That ultimately people want to be part of a majority. In functional, healthy societies, that's what they want to do. And so all we need to do is change around, it's not a trivial thing when I say all, but the incentive structures, which are right now balkanized for I think exactly the reasons that you say, because it is convenient, not just for kind of the global, some shadowy elite, that's like behind the Wizard of Oz curtain, but also there are various ethnic elites who in the current rules-based order that we've set up can derive power and prestige from dominating in a particular minority community. So I think there's lots of different bad actors at play here. But yeah, I think if we got control of the border, changed around the incentive structure. I mean, the only way we're going to survive as a successful going concern is if we recreate a majority ethnicity. And again, I think it's doable. It's a hard thing. It has to start with getting control of the border, but I think it can be done.
Okay. My name is Steven. I really appreciate the mention of John Dewey and John. I think Dewey is really important in the sense that he tried to reconstitute liberal democracy on the basis of loving liberty as such, without having any religious backdrop for unifying the American people. And I think what all of you are describing are sort of the consequences of that vision of trying to create a people who just love liberty as such. My question is, well, what happens after liberalism? What happens, what are the sources of solidarity for this American people after liberalism? And I want to stress, I mean solidarity, not consensus. Consensus is, to me, more of a rational-based agreement on certain propositions, but solidarity strikes at something deeper, of a shared hope, of a shared destiny that the American people face. What do you think will make the American people feel one again?
Dr. Gottfried, is that?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned John Dewey. I probably don't know as much about him as you do, since you work in the field of education, history of education. But I think Mike, okay. But I think he is a significant figure in redefining liberalism. It's not so much liberty that he's concerned with, but individual self-realization as brought about by the government, public administration, and public education as defined by experts like himself. So he's really not concerned about liberty at all. He's concerned about the state's role in developing the individual character in a way that is consonant or consistent with the state's goals. By the way, he was a big fan of Marxism, although he rejected Stalin. If you remember, he was a friend of Trotsky. I'm not quite sure to what extent he was a consistent theoretical Marxist, but he was certainly influenced by socialist and communist models for what he wanted for the United States. My argument, of course, is that all of these people are post-liberal. I do not accept the notion that what we're living through is the victory of liberalism, is whatever replaced liberalism, which to me is unfortunately by now mostly defunct ideology that belongs to the 19th century, which is the argument of my book, After Liberalism. And what's replaced it is a horror show. I'm very sympathetic to liberalism in my book, because what's come after it is exactly what Auron described, managerial control. It's exactly what you described as some form of neo-paganism in which people are after power. And there's many ways by which this has been achieved over the last 70, 80 years. Throughout my life, I can see the present order coming into being. I don't blame this on liberalism, however. I think it is this post-liberal order which has turned totalitarian. And another point I think is interesting is the connection between this and Marxism. I'm always denying that the woke left is Marxist, which it's not in terms of its belief system, but it is like Marxism in terms of the people it appeals to, particularly in Western countries. There are people who hate what we consider to be normal bourgeois Christians. They despise these people. They feel they're outsiders. They feel alienated from this order, particularly intellectuals. And they were able to move very quickly from being soft on the Soviet Union, which is what the left was when I was in graduate school back in the mid-1960s. They were always apologizing for the communists. The same people, I'm sure, if they lived long enough, became wokesters. And I think it has to do with the personality of the people who joined the left. I mean, they're on a power trip. They also hate normal people. And I think this is a dominant characteristic. And it is what sort of links their sympathy for communism at one time with their embrace of woke ideology now. But I see these people really as living beyond the liberal age. And the question, and I think it's the most relevant one that I think all of us have tried to address, what do you do at this point? To keep these people from exercising even more destructive power. And I wish I had answers, but I think at the end of the day, I'm stuck with the problem, and I'm listening to younger people, providing these tentative answers.
Ken Masugi, thank you for your really enlightening and very sobering remarks. Mark here brought out some of the issues that I wanted you to confront. I'll just recall an observation by Dinesh D'Souza a few decades ago, and he said, well, can you really imagine a white American shaving and saying, yes, in me flows the blood of Shakespeare? I mean, it's ridiculous. So when we think about these things, I think maybe John's observations about Christianity are very helpful here. If you put them together with the notion of the equality of the social contract, because I think you need both that Enlightenment notion and the Christian understanding. You have to bring both together to get the appropriate thematic or spirited response in addition to the philosophical.
Just a comment there, I guess. Is that right? Okay, thank you.
Dan McCarthy, and I guess my question will follow on from what Ken has just said. So John talked about the importance of Christianity and its connection with a certain kind of rights and freedoms that we enjoy as Americans. This is actually something that Sam Francis, whom Auron talked about and whom Paul knew very well, is critical of. That Sam Francis, in fact, fits the description you gave, John, of a pagan, and projected the egalitarianism he saw as coming from Christianity. And Ken just now has asked also about the egalitarian elements of the Enlightenment or other traditions that are maybe post-Christian or modern that America has also partaken of. So my question really for John and for Auron and Paul is how to reconcile these different elements on the right, some of which from St. Francis seem to be rather pagan, but others are quite firmly Christian.
I don't know how to reconcile them. It's a short answer. I think to sort of zoom way out, what we're seeing now, what we're kind of rediscovering is that what you might call the Elizabethan religious compromise, where you substitute, you maintain the form, but without the substance of religion, thinking it's sufficient for the needs of the state and society, is not going to work. And it's something that we are, it is becoming increasingly obvious, I think, that the Enlightenment alone, the sort of what I called the grab bag of Enlightenment ideas, is not enough to sustain a self-governing republic like ours. And the truth, the underlying truth of the thing matters. And I think we're starting to see that come out in increasingly obvious and disturbing ways. That if we don't get back to the truth of the thing, then we're going to lose the republic, and it's not going to be pretty. But in terms of how reconciling all these competing elements of the right, I think the main thing is that they all have to agree with me.
Auron, do you have a quick remark to that question too?
Sure. I'm myself a Christian, so I don't really have a lot of truck with Sam Francis's criticism of Christianity, though I find him to be a very insightful thinker otherwise. I would say, however, that it's important to remember that equality before God does not necessarily destroy natural hierarchy, and pretending that that's not going to be an element of social organization is kind of always a mistake. In the obsession to immunize the eschaton, we often take the promises of all men being equal before God and suddenly try to make all men equal here on earth. And that is always a totalitarian disaster. I think that's easy for everyone on the right to agree with while still understanding the truth of Christian principle of equality before God.
Okay, we've only got about 2 minutes left, so we'll take 2 more questions, maybe. I think there's 2 more we can take. So.
Thank you. Adam Stutz, I'm from South Africa, and we have a term called South Africanization, which means as countries become more like South Africa, it's a process of South Africanization. So my question is, what happens, I would love to hear from you, what happens if this South Africanization process continues in America? And what I mean by that is, the arrows that are typically in the American conservative quiver currently are things like organizing conferences like these, going to the media, starting doing podcasts, things like that, voting, getting the right people in the Senate and so forth. But what happens if America loses, if you lose on immigration and these things, and you cannot use these means anymore? The only way for the Republicans to win is to become much more secular and much more culturally shallow and so forth. So I'd love to hear some thoughts from you on if that type of scenario materializes, what do we do then?
Okay, what are our most effective arrows for stopping the South Africanization of America?
Yeah, well, I actually get asked a lot about South Africanization in the context of my own book. And I think that one of the things that, the kind of white pill that I was giving them, wow, all these congressmen are interested in all these other things, isn't that great? There's sort of a secret black pill behind that, and that I think the reason why it's all happening, and even the reason why a book like mine can be written, is because the situation's actually gotten a lot worse, and so people are desperate, and they're like, okay, we'll even let that nut talk, and write his book, because we need to do something. I do think that these are the eras, but I guess I both from a religious perspective, but even from a secular perspective, I would feel not quite along the same dimension, but I feel with the same outcome. I don't think that the leftist buckmen win. I just think that they can't sustain a healthy society, and therefore there are going to be communities, one of the reasons I go to things like this, that will ultimately emerge, even if we end up in the rubble. The communities that emerge out of that rubble will be the sorts of things that we create, both in our local communities at home and through leadership networks like this. And I think that that's a really powerful arrow in the quiver. And I don't know how it's going to wind up. I'm watching. I'm trying to react to events as they happen. I'm trying to make sure I have a lot of ammo. I live in Montana, so this is a good problem. And then just be ready for what happens. But I think the good news is, both from a Christian perspective, we believe it absolutely, but I think even if I didn't believe in that way, I don't think the bad guys win. We just have to be ready.
Okay, we're technically out of time, so what I'm going to do is just ask, would you all successively just ask your question very succinctly, and let's get them all out so we can all hear them and we can contribute to the conversation. But we'll have to wrap it up, and maybe we can get an answer after the panel. So just very quickly, what's your
about the overview on the anti-white racism. So for me, I saw it in graduate school, and it was very in the front. And I see a lot of people waking up, and a lot of people reverting. Like in 2016, they did Black Lives Matter, and now they're fully on board with it. So just have your take on that.
Okay, next question.
Regarding the paganism, I think we've seen what it looks like. There's rites, which include sexualized gyration in the street or in the hospital. There's a sacrament, which involves the mRNA cocktail, which combines abortion and the idea you could reprogram what a human is. And there's even high priests, guys like Witch Dr. Fauci. So my question, though, is, when you have faith leaders from Rome to Protestant churches within walking distance of us who embrace that, how does Christianity or a revival of that become a solution when the Pope or Baptist churches down the street embrace the mRNA and the neo-paganism?
Thank you.
So on the question about the historic origins of managerialism and specifically its social function, do you think this is a development that has unique origins in the Anglosphere, and where it's advanced elsewhere, it's really just a cultural export that's been thoroughly matured here? And what might that imply about the themes of inclination to Christianize progressive social reformist tendencies?
Thank you.
What makes you think that a strategy of localization and separation of church and state wins in the big tide of demographic change that we want? And why isn't a Trump, Le Pen, hard strike, close the border strategy much more effective? What is that?
Thank you.
My question is for Mr. Carl. Are you aware that this summer is White Boy Summer? And do you support it? And do you have any other ideas for kids who aren't necessarily in the public square yet to practice this anti-white?
Thank you. Okay, final question.
what are not basic, but advanced multi-year projects and associations and things that young guys like me, and not just individuals, but friend groups and other people here, what are advanced institutions and projects that young guys like me can go and complete and start building now to prevent the collapse and South Africanization? Without a panel.
Yeah, and I would say national conservatism perhaps is one of those. So, all right, well, feel free to ask our panelists afterward, but thank you everybody for coming. We appreciate it. Go get some lunch, and we'll see you in the afternoon.